So my name is Skip Newberry. Can everyone hear me okay in the back? Great, excellent. So we have a really exciting panel here tonight that I'm really looking forward to. Over the last 9 months or so, there's been a project team here in the Portland area that's been working on what's called the Global Smart Cities Challenge. And it started back in September in Washington, D.C., and we have this cast of characters that has come around this initiative over the last many months, including Intel and Seabourne. Mike is from Intel, and Mike is from Intel. We also have some other groups and organizations and companies that are involved as well, including PSU and elements of the city of Portland and IBI Global, which is an engineering firm that focuses on smart city related work. And this is really the first time that we've really had a chance to talk publicly about some of the work that has been underway here, and also share some of the insights, the lessons learned. And what's going to be great about the panel, I think, tonight is that, Wilf approaches this from a very broad perspective. He's done work at Intel on a lot of these issues with the Internet of Things and data and smart cities, really all over the world. And he knows a lot of kind of what's going on in the United States on this issue right now as well. Mike and his company with Seabourne have been doing a lot of work on data and visualizations, unlocking legacy systems, legacy data that exists at the federal level, and helping to make it available for kind of public consumption, working with governments in a variety of different locations. So without further ado, I want to have Wilf take it away and start off the discussion this evening, and then we'll have Mike follow that up. And then we'll do a nice Q&A session following that. Wilf?
Thanks. Can people hear this? Does this one work? It does. I'll let you keep that. I'll stand up here because I'm not tall enough without it. Who knows? I mean, these terms are commonly known here, right? So Internet of Things, does everybody know what Internet of Things is? Obviously, you know what big data is, and smart cities. What about smart cities? So I'll talk a little bit more about smart cities then. I pulled these slides together from a number of different places that we've been working on, and we want to go through this fairly quickly because I think most of this should be discussion. But both Mike and I cover some of this material up front, particularly if you're not that familiar with smart cities and what people are trying to do here. And I'll give a little bit of background, but I will start with sort of the market trends that are going on that are driving the ability for us to think about what smart cities are and how they might work. We'll talk a little bit about the Global City Challenge. Skip already talked about this. It's a White House initiative. And I'll talk a little bit about why they're doing it and what the interest is. And then our response to that, which is this Power Corridor project, which is a big initiative within the city that we're basically piggybacking on to look for ways to innovate in smart cities. And then we'll, if you have any questions, we don't need to wait till the end for questions. Please feel free to chip in, particularly if I'm not being clear about something. The obvious trends that we're familiar with, the availability of compute, the availability of networking, the availability of sensors, the growing amount of data that's available for analysis are pretty standard trends that we all know about. They're being driven by this sort of economic downdrive in costs across all aspects of data management, data collection. Over the last 10 years, we've seen these significant cost reductions in sensors, in network bandwidth, and in processing. And this sort of is the basis for why this is starting to happen now. There are sensors in just about everything. You carry them around in your phone. We can start building them into buildings and in infrastructure. And so this is the basis for what's going on in smart cities. And there's an enormous opportunity, and I won't spend as much time on this as maybe given how much you know about this. I'll use a few anecdotes because it's easier that way. This figure of $200 billion is the amount of money that's spent on commercial and industrial building energy. And if you could manage it a little bit better, the estimate is that something like 30% of that is wasted one way or another. Building lights being on when the buildings are not occupied. Leaving conference room lights on. If it could be a little bit more efficiently managed, we could save quite a bit. And that's just a typical example. Also, you could look at this from perspective of just sensors in retail around making sure that shelves are stocked. There's an estimate that about $850 billion is wasted by either overstocking or understocking shelves nationwide. So these are enormous numbers. Some of the anecdotes that go beyond this, really, in the sense of cities, and these are IoT numbers. These are not city numbers. But you start to run into similar things when you start talking about the power in a city and how much power is spent driving, traffic lights, street lights, how much water is wasted in our water supply system, how much energy is wasted in transmission. There are all sorts of ways in which, by instrumenting and managing these facilities more effectively, we can drive down the costs and we can improve the infrastructure fairly substantially. With instrumentation and gathering data and doing analysis on it. An example of a situation, I think New York City had a situation where they were having regular drainage functioning problems, and they couldn't figure it out. In many cases, the problem, they know what, we'll know a problem in our city, but we just won't know where it is. This problem was traced back eventually. Once they started putting sensors on things, it was traced back to a small handful of restaurants that were dumping grease into the sewer system. That's the kind of thing. If you can start to detect where the blockage is happening, then you can trace back and figure out what happened. A lot of water is lost. We don't know where it is. We don't think of it as polluting the ground because it's just potable drinking water. But we lose a lot in cracked pipes. And you can't find those pipes in a city because they're typically under the road. So if you have sensors that will, at each junction, you can start to trace down, where in a length of pipe there might be water missing. So there's all sorts of ways in which we can instrument our infrastructure, collect data, do analysis, figure out where there are breaks, much more efficiently maintain that infrastructure and use that infrastructure. Lots of different ways to do that. And then just sort of generally across the various areas, healthcare, automotive, retail, we talked about a few of them, but there are all sorts of ways to instrument this whole infrastructure, and a lot of it ties back together around cities and city infrastructure. And Intel's been doing this for a long time. We have developed what we've called the London Living Lab, in which there are parts of London now that we can go in and install various different sensing infrastructure in collaboration with different groups. I won't go into these a lot, but obviously around schools, around energy, around security, around the better use of the infrastructure, as we just talked about. So there's lots of ways in which we want to be able to understand how instrumentation could be used. It's still in the early phases, and we haven't really figured out the right ways to use the infrastructure yet. So let's talk a little bit about global cities. So global cities, because we're so early in this, a lot of the early development was happening in Europe. I think the White House felt that we needed to do more to do economic development in the U.S. Some of the figures, early figures in the White House are that the Internet of Things should have the similar kind of uplift on the economic activity in the country over the next 20 years that the internet has had in the last 20 years. So that was about a 3% uplift in GDP. So there's a belief that there is significant opportunity here. The White House wants to make sure that all U.S. companies have good access to that. And they put this program together. Actually, they put a program together last year called Smart Cities. It was driven primarily out of Office of Science and Technology Policy and National Institute of Standards and Technology. And the idea there was to bring together companies around the United States to show what we were capable of doing. That didn't really benefit us much. We were talking to one another. So this year they decided to do a Global Cities Challenge and bring in cities from around the world that are working on this, so potentially customers for all of us. So the group of companies that Skip talked about were all companies in the Portland area who were interested in getting engaged and playing with the White House on this Global Cities Initiative to look at how we might develop concepts that would have economic value for the region. In other words, it's not just about making Portland smarter, It's about making Portland potentially a test bed for how some of these technologies could be deployed. It is very difficult at this early stage, as we found out in London, to justify any of these. In many cases, if you really want to put the infrastructure in place, you have to deploy a lot of networking, a lot of storage, and a lot of computing power for any one of the pieces of infrastructure you want to put in place. It really starts to play, just like the internet starts to play, when everything is connected, when you've got data coming in from many places, and when every decision that the city makes starts to become data-driven. That's when it really plays. So these early stages, it's worth thinking about this from a point of view, at least from a Portland point of view, around it from a point of view of economic development. What is it that we can learn by working with a city that's forward-looking, is civically driven, about how we might use these technologies wisely and effectively to make a better place to live. So I think that's a large part of what we're doing. Hopefully in the process of it, we can make some better decisions, and we'll talk about what we're doing in the PAL project to do that. But I think keep in mind that this is early and we want to learn how to do this, and doing it in Portland hopefully will help Portland companies. Question?
Standards. How are you guys addressing that part?
Are you going to talk about that, Mike? Mike's going to talk about that. I'll just pass that one off to Mike because that's a hard question. No, Intel does work on standards. So in an environment like this where there are a lot of standards and a lot of players involved in those standards, there are a number of techniques, but I think Mike knows a little bit more about what some of the data standards that are out there right now are. But I think part of the reason why NIST is driving this is they see this as a very important space. How do we make sure that we, one, allow innovation to happen, which is typically destructive to standards, and then how do you then start to pull things back together again so as you can then drive business growth, right? So in the early stages, you want kind of chaos. You want people to go out and try things. Yeah.
What one guy learns versus the other guy.
Yeah. It's a very good question. And when do you start to, in order to get these very large markets, you have to standardize things. But in order to figure out what you want to do, you want to try many different ways of doing things. I think we're still in the try many ways of doing things, but there are a number of initiatives, including things like Green Button out of NIST for energy standards and gathering information about energy. And they're trying to stretch that into a number of other areas. As you know, the administration is very active in this idea of open data, and this plays into that space. So once you collect a lot of this data about the water system or whatever else, you want to be able to make sure that it's available and that people can grab it and use it for analytics. And I think that's another reason why Portland's interesting, because I think there's been a lot of effort in Portland to make most of the civic data available publicly, which is I think necessary for innovation here. So the Global Cities Team Challenge, 48 companies or 48 groups that are teams that in many cases involve cities and public groups and private industry are getting together to sort of show off activities. I think it's better this time. The first time we did this with the Smart Cities a year ago, it was very much focused at sort of individual projects. So somebody was looking at the water system, somebody was looking at security. Clearly, from an Intel perspective, we would like to see these aggregate together and think about smart cities in general. So we've been pushing in that direction. Because there are a number of cities, there is a little bit more of that, but it still does tend to look like individual projects. So when you look at the individual projects that are out there, they can sort of be classified in these areas. So you've got, transportation, public safety, education, workforce, what are the other ones? Energy, energy utilities in this way. I think when this starts to mature, you'll see the infrastructure go in place, and then you'll see things being connected much more broadly. And you won't necessarily see them as individual projects, because quite often the kinds of questions you want to ask, you don't really know what data you need until you want to ask the question. Like, for example, if you want to build a new river crossing, there's an enormous amount of data that plays into data driving that kind of decision with data, and you don't necessarily get it just by putting structural stress tests on the bridge or by putting sensors in the water to figure out what the bio content is or whatever. You tend to want to have a lot of different data. So these are the kinds of projects that are out there. We happen to be classified into transportation. I'll talk about that just a little bit in just a little bit, but because it's Powell and because it's driven by transportation up and down Powell, it has been classified in the Powell district. But there's a lot of economic district, but there's a lot of along Powell district, and I think that's probably what's going to become more interesting as we go forward. So let me keep going reasonably quickly here. Yeah, I can. This is really what it looks like from the team perspective. TriMet's involved, Portland State, IBI, Intel, Serra, Architects, Seabourne. So we've got a pretty good group of people here touching a lot of different parts of what's going on. And the idea is that we look at environmental and a transportation perspective. There are a number of things on the Powell corridor that we can take advantage of. There are sections of it that have computer-controlled traffic lights. There are sections of it that have sensors on them. Yeah, question? The Powell project is actually the whole, let me bring it up, is actually the whole section. So we're actually focused just down in this area at the moment. But the interesting thing about the sort of eco-districts that have been established, and they're really quite different economically. So as we look at what decisions we might want to make, it's good to have a transportation corridor that covers the kinds of different areas that we have in Portland, because it will help us understand what's important in different areas. Serra Architects has done some really interesting work as far as what they call civic ecology, which is using civic groups to get together to help make up the motivators for what you want to do in each of these regions. I think that it's dangerous with techie companies getting in there first, that you can find yourself with a lot of technology and not a lot of better living. And part of the reason to bring Serra Architects in is that they are pushing us in that direction, and it sometimes feels a little touchy-feely, but I think it's really critical as far as making the right decisions about what makes it a better place to live, rather than just a better instrumented, so it really covers these different eco areas, and so this could be going on for a while, and we could take advantage of this project for a while and instrument it and learn, and then instrument another eco district in a better way and learn more. So I think there's a lot of opportunity in doing that. As I said earlier, a lot of this looks like it's about transportation and environment, but it's actually about learning how to gather information about transportation and how to gather information about environment and how they might play off against one another. Does, changing the way that the traffic flow works have any measurable effect on environmental quality down the Powell corridor? How far away from the Powell Street itself does that affect the homes? We don't know these things. We would love to know these things. Those kinds of things are the sort of basis for this. Now, building a whole project just based on that decision, again, is not sufficient to justify the investment from the perspective of just that decision. But the idea that we're learning how to gather data and how to do the analytics and put some infrastructure in place, I think means that over the next 5 or 10 years, we will be able to put in other sensors and gather a lot more information and make better decisions as we go along. There is intent to do quite a lot with transportation down Powell. They're thinking about bus rapid transit down there. So there's a lot going on in that area. And if we can get baseline now and then measure as things develop on the Powell corridor, I think we'll gather a lot of information that's not just useful for us in making decisions, but could be baseline for a lot of other cities. So we could become an expert as a city. We could become experts in this kind of information, and I believe that will drive the economic development that we really want. Let me try to wrap this up. Well, I think that is pretty much the set of slides that I put together here. Any other questions here? And I'll hand off to Mike, because Mike's going to talk more about the software side and the data infrastructure. So let's let him talk. Will, yeah.
How do you balance the desire and the need for all this data with privacy of the individual?
So that's a really long answer. I think that is critical. I hope this is one of the things we start to learn here. There are a lot of opinions about how to do this. The one that I like the most, there are certain things that you do want to keep private, and you can certainly take individual information, so you can aggregate a lot of this data. I think that's probably the first point. I think the second point that's really interesting, at least I think it's worth discussing is the fact that that actually I think most of us don't mind data being shared as long as it's balanced, as long as there's not one person who has all the data and you don't. I think the idea of having open public data that's somewhat aggregated, I think solves a lot of these problems. But I think we're going to learn, right? We're going to find out. There are a lot of situations in which just the existence of the data could change power balance that might be quite disruptive. I think mostly for the positive, but then the people who are disrupted may not feel that way. I mean, you can just imagine if we had a detailed information about the environmental quality around the city, it would change property values. That's an enormous thing, right? If you have asthma and you can look at your Zillow map and say, oh yeah, this area is not good for me, that's going to change property values. So I think there is disruption that's going to happen here, but I think it's probably for the positive, right? I think that that's livability for me. If you can go to a city and identify an area of the city that's not going to make you less healthy, that's a really big step in the right direction. So I think there's two issues associated with that. One is the sort of power balance shift that comes as you go through a transition like this. And then the second thing is what's ideal state. And there are still privacy questions associated with the ideal state that I don't think we've answered yet, but we'll have to answer them as we get to them. Mike, do you want to? Oh, you need to unplug.
And also we can do more questions at the end, but I think it'll be good for Mike to maybe head some off, and then we'll see what's left for the group afterwards.
All right. Can you all hear me? Sound good? All right. So quick question here. How many, so just to calibrate how much detail we go into and where, raise your hand if you consider yourself more on the technical side of things. Okay, so that's pretty overwhelming. I think I know where to go with this. So this is at a fairly high level, but we can dive down into some particular details on the technical side if you have questions. I think there's enough terms here that it should map for everybody. So I think the thing to start with the smart cities, which is what's really interesting and why certainly I personally find it really fascinating, this whole space. I think Wilf talked about this, is nobody really knows what the killer app yet is for smart cities. There's all this great infrastructure that's beginning to be developed. There's these really interesting ideas around technology and sensors, things that really weren't possible even 2 or 3 years ago from a data collection standpoint. Gives us all of these really interesting opportunities to sort of play around. And I'm sure you all are familiar with the Gartner hype cycle. We're at the really early stages of what's possible, which is fascinating and exciting. And I think why there's all these diverse players who are putting time and energy into figuring this out. But fundamentally, nobody yet knows what the killer app is or the killer apps are for this idea of the smart city. So what this whole Portland project is about is starting down that road of figuring out what that looks like. So from a not just a technical standpoint, but from a conceptual standpoint, certainly, but an architectural standpoint, an urban planning standpoint, a city management standpoint. There's all of these really interesting questions about what's possible, but how does that really map to the decisions that people are going to make? And as Wilf said, it's great living in a place where there's a lot of sensors, but if that doesn't actually make our lives better in some way, then it's kind of an exercise in futility. So one of our starting assumptions was there's this idea of a virtuous cycle of data, and the other title for this could have been smart cities and agile approach for you developers, right? So this cycle, this virtuous cycle of data will look familiar from a development standpoint because it's really about iterating and improving, right? So the theory is you create better data that allows people to make better decisions, which builds support in the community for more data. And then you're able to put new sensors out, collect different types of data, and that feeds back into management decisions, urban planning, that kind of thing, which then builds more community support and engagement. And one of the ideas that I think has been really fascinating about this project is that idea of support for the for smart cities and for data and for planning is really exciting, because there's an opportunity to sort of democratize data in a way, instead of being something that gets fed into, you know, the people at City Hall who are making management decisions. There's now this really exciting opportunity to explore how do you provide this information out to people at the neighborhood level. So at sort of the hyper local, block by block, you, as in citizens of the city, have the opportunity suddenly to get insights into what's going on in your world that you previously that suddenly you can be, you know, not just more informed about what's happening, but ultimately be making your own decisions that are creating a better city. So so for the shifting gears. So for a little bit, think there's the 3 V's that everybody's familiar with in big data: volumes, velocity, and variety. So for us, we think about it as applying those 3 V's within the smart city context. The first is accessing large volumes of data, right? So all of these sensors are collecting data anywhere from, you know, 10 to 60 hertz, so 10 to 60 times a second. So there's this volume of data that is really exciting and exceptional. There's this of data that we've never had. The second is processing the data at high velocity. So it's changing rapidly. You've got real-time streams. There's a bunch of technical challenges, both at the hardware and software level, for processing that and understanding what it is you're going to do with the data, rather than taking 6 months of data and crunching it a year later. You're looking at being able to make sort of real-time decisions. And the third is comparing a variety of data to inform decisions. And I think this is sort of the most interesting, actually. Data in of itself, and we'll talk about this a little later, is just data. It begins to have value when you're able to compare and bring together a lot of different data to provide, you know, the classic actionable insight that everybody talks about. So what we know, let's start here. So as we've been thinking about this project and applying the virtuous cycle, we know a little bit about how people think about data and how they use data. And so we think about this as a spectrum. And on one end, you've got this explore use case, right? And this is really people who are sort of data scientists, right? You can think about people who really know data, and they're looking at a pool of data, and they're trying to figure out what is in that data that I don't know. What are the questions that I need to ask? What's most interesting about this? From a design standpoint, from a technology standpoint, you end up with something that needs to be much more interactive, much more complex to I think acknowledge the complexity of the data. And from an investment standpoint, you end up with something that is more complex, e.g. more expensive. At the other end of the spectrum is this monitor use case. And this is for somebody who maybe isn't as much of an expert, or maybe isn't as sophisticated about the data, but they need to know what it is they're, right, or sort of monitor that indicator or that metric that's going to tell them what's most important to them. So air quality is a great example, right? Most people here probably are most interested in understanding what is the air quality outside my house today, rather than spending 4 hours exploring the trends and interactions in air quality over the last 4 years and doing that on a regular basis. So the challenge is creating an interface to that data, a visualization or a report or a dashboard, whatever it is, that's understandable and simple. And that's often a harder challenge in some ways than building the complex experience around data, right? Really elegantly and clearly describing and showing what it is people need to get to take away from data is where, you know, there's a lot of art rather than science. Okay, so as we've been thinking about this project, we split it into 4 sort of user stories, right? Thinking about 4 audiences for the data, and going from again, not just, who's in City Hall, who are the researchers at Portland State who are looking at the data, but what's the broader community look like? So we defined these sort of four personas. So we've got the resident, and interested in hyperlocal data. So really something that's around their, 4, 5, 6 block radius. Obviously, at times they're going to be interested in more, but from a day-to-day usage standpoint, something that's probably much more on the monitor side rather than the explore side. We've got the idea of a city planner, somebody who's interested at that neighborhood level data, but looking at it much more holistically across the city. The city manager mayor, somebody who's interested in those citywide metrics, right? How are we doing against performance metrics or measurements that we've set out? Are we, over or under air quality for the year? And then there's the academic, the scientist, and they're interested in the data, right? The visualizations, all the other stuff is conceptually interesting, but they want to be doing the really in-depth analysis of historical data and real-time data to figure out, what are the relationships, what are the correlations and trends. So our challenge has been, how do we think about both the technology infrastructure, but also think about presentationally providing the same data to these really 4 different personas and scenarios and use cases, so that people who are on different ends of the consumption spectrum for data get the value that they need out of it. So what we've built, and I think it's worth emphasizing here, this is really a very early starting place for where this should go in the future. So what we've built has been some exciting concepts and some exciting thinking, but it's really about where can we go. So the basic architecture for what this looks like is fairly straightforward, and we'll talk about some of the details. But basically, there's 3 types of data, right? You've got historical sources from within government. You've got real-time sensors, which Will talked about. There's a lot of growth in the sensor space. So there's, now it's sort of commodity that you can get all this great real-time data, huge volumes, and then you've got social contextual information. So you've got obviously, Twitter data, which can be really interesting when you aggregate and analyze it and compare it to, weather, air quality, right? So the challenge is sort of building this hub that brings everything together. And this includes, two main components. The first is data processing. So being able to bring it together and do some translation on the data so that it becomes usable and accessible to everybody. And then putting an open API layer on top of that makes it consumable so that people can access the information. And then we've been, thinking about these different presentations of the data. So the sort of executive dashboard style, the analysis exploration tool, and then sort of the neighborhood report that's going to provide that hyperlocal information. So within the PDX case study, we've been pulling transportation data from 3 sources. So this is all coming out of Portland State University. We've got air quality data that's going to be coming from these sensors, as well as from some existing sensors that the city put up, as well as the state. So we've got interesting historic data as well as real-time data that we're able to bring together and start to do interesting things with. And largely it's interesting to get into some of the more technical side. We've found pragmatically that CSV files are still the lingua franca of data exchange, as much as we all want sort of more interesting, you can argue typed or, strongly typed or weakly typed or all that stuff. You can get a CSV of pretty much anything from anybody with pretty low lift. So a lot of the data that we've been working with is coming in CSV formats, but we really like from an API standpoint, obviously JSON is sort of, where I think everybody's going from an API standards. So, and then, pretty straightforward RESTful APIs with some, full query access. So what we've learned from this process, first thing, again, data in of itself doesn't have value. It's just numbers, right? So you give people data and they're not going to look at a big table and derive very much value from it. So that value is created when they can translate that data into some sort of decision making. And is to understand is, the relationships between cause and effect is really how most people use data to inform decision making, right? So if I make a decision and the data shows me something, right, then I can start to loop back and have this feedback cycle of making different decisions, and hopefully the data will reflect some sort of change. So, so that last point, this is some of the data that we've been working with, right? We've got the orange yellowish bars are wind speed measured at a location, and the blue line is nitrogen dioxide emissions, right? So there's an interesting, you see an inverse relationship. As the wind speed goes down, the nitrogen dioxide emissions go up, and then vice versa, right? So this is a super simple example, but one that shows once we begin to overlay and compare this data, we start to see interesting trends, right? If we looked at any one of these in isolation, it's not particularly interesting, but suddenly when we see the relationship between wind speed and nitrogen dioxide we get to understand better how we might want to make decisions. So if it's windy, I can have more confidence that the air quality is probably a little bit better around my house. So the types of questions that we're looking to ask of this data here in Portland are really focused, as Wolf said, around traffic and air quality, and what might that relationship look like. So how does traffic flow impact air quality on a particular block, on a particular sort of how do modes of transportation change air quality during the day? So if we see during rush hour, there's a high amount of particulate matter, but during middle of the day when it's mostly bus traffic, the air quality improves. That can inform some decisions from a planning standpoint. Some of the cooler stuff is when you start to mess with traffic light patterns. How does that impact air quality? So if we have a particular traffic light pattern that we find smoothed out, flow, that's less trucks of houses. That means that diesel emissions are better for everybody throughout the day. And then the one that's Portland. So should I bike to work today? Right. The question everybody's interested in is both, is it a nice day and is it pretty, and should I bike? But also if we can start to measure on a sort of route by route, block by block basis, what does the air quality look like, and direct you around places where there's a lot of emissions, suddenly you get to make much more interesting, informed decisions about how you commute to work. So, this idea of comparing data provides real insights. How do we enable this? The demonstration project that we're working on is really focused on some best practices and seeing these played out with real data so that we can begin to experiment and iterate and improve. So the four core best practices from a technology standpoint that we're working around is, first, open formats, open source where possible. Formats from a data exchange standpoint, JSON, CSV, anybody can access those with any technology. And I think one of the really interesting, exciting things about the smart cities ecosystem that's starting to emerge is it's not about any one vendor, it's not about any one platform, it's about the constellation of data and systems that come together and communicate and allow you to overlay that data, so that idea of design a system of systems rather than a monolithic data warehouse or a monolithic platform. Suddenly we want to be thinking from the ground up of different partnerships with different data that we can begin to combine and do interesting things with. So leads us to the third best practice, focus on portability. How, from both an architectural design standpoint, but also from a data design standpoint, do we make the data as portable as possible? So the question of standardization is a really fascinating one, because in some ways standardization can be really helpful for helping people adopt new technologies and new data. On the other hand, it makes data inherently less portable because you have to adopt the particular standard in order to do something with it. So the fourth point is thinking about data and standardization in a different way, thinking about it from the standpoint of translation and making the data easily translatable between different systems, different formats, different typing, rather than big S standardization. So, the alternative, which I think there have been a lot of initiatives at the federal level thinking through, how do we all get together in a room for 8 years and, come up with a big XML schema for how this data is supposed to be represented. And the thing is, there is no one right way to do it, so nobody can ever agree. So the key from an agile standpoint from an agile standpoint, focus on translation, documentation, thinking about open source code libraries that allow people to pull that data in and do different things with it, and easily understand how to get it into their own database structure or database schema or technology. So wrap up with back to this idea: iterate and improve. And all of the stuff that we've been building, we're on the path to figuring out what the killer app is. But honestly, this project is not about creating the killer app. It's about thinking through the infrastructure questions, the data questions that will lay the groundwork for somebody else, hopefully you all, figuring out what that killer app really is, and putting in place the hardware, the software, the systems, the processing, the partnerships that are going to make that data available so that you all can come up with those really interesting, cool visualizations, applications that are gonna do that, and the city becomes in some way the provider, the bedrock, the foundation of that from a technology and data standpoint. So how can you all help? Skip, do you wanna give the plug?
All right. So on Saturday, we're going to be doing a little bit of a hackathon with some of the data that some of which Mike alluded to that we've generated from the Southeast Powell corridor, and we'll be looking at creating some interesting visualizations that we in turn are going to take with us to DC, Washington DC, on June 1st. Which is when there's going to be a global city project challenge, Tech Jam is what they're calling it, with White House officials and officials from different federal agencies. We learned the King and Queen of the Netherlands are going to be there, along with some other representatives from other countries, about 1,000 attendees, mayors of different cities. And so it's a great opportunity to showcase a little bit of kind of what's been happening at a largely grassroots level here in Portland, with this collection of mix of volunteers and people doing it for their day jobs, coming together to work on this project. And what'll be interesting about the hackathon this Saturday is whatever comes out of that is going to be a central point in this presentation that we're giving June 1st in DC, because so much of what the National Institute of Standards and Technology and the White House are looking to see out of this is not just an interesting science experiment with 5 people saying, wow, we have some great data. Rather, it's more about, how can behavior be changed at scale within different communities around the country and around the world. So Mike alluded to this. Mike's example, your commute based on really informative data focused on air quality and adjust your course accordingly. That's kind of the tip of the iceberg of what's possible with this. And so looking at ways that we can, make the data meaningful to a wide variety of people through these visualizations in the ways that we share data and allow people to change their behavior is really kind of the main goal and objective with both the challenge and is kind of the thing we have to keep in mind as we go forward with this project and any variation from it is, science experiments and sort of the technology piece of it can be interesting, but we can't lose sight of the bigger opportunity to change people's behavior and focus on these big policy goals. So that's one way you can definitely get involved. Out of this project, we've seen some interesting stuff come to light as well, where TriMet got invited in pretty early on, and now they're looking at a first mile, last mile challenge for the fall that we're working on with them and putting together. Thinking about the public transit system and bike sharing and technology and ride sharing, if that ever happens as well, is something that is going to be, I think, an exciting opportunity to look at how it all fits together. And data and the Internet of Things and these policy considerations are what really link it all together. I had it up after Wilf ended his portion, and now after Mike, I'm sure there's more. So want to see if there are any questions from the audience. Actually, yes. Sorry, Pink. Yeah, Pink. Yeah, go for it.
You.
Yes. Yes, in fact, the site for registering for the hackathon has the API and the data available on it. So contributions can be made beforehand and afterwards as well. Yep.
Be a significant project.
It's back on.
I don't know if you can hear me.
Yeah, no, that's fine. I was just giving him his mic back.
It's the Fayetteville Freeway corridor. It has large tracts of undeveloped land still. You cannot cross the street in places. There's a strange piece of freeway that it's not safe for bikes, pedestrians, or anything. That's the underpass under the railroad tracks on 17. If you didn't just study the part that's already starting to gentrify, but went further out, where you can't cross the street, where there's no sidewalks, and you have undeveloped land, but it's still in the core of the city, build things and study the effect they're doing in those cities elsewhere.
Yeah, I mean, some of the cities I think you're probably mentioning are new being built. They're being built that way. I actually think it's more interesting to tackle a city like Portland that has a bit of both. See how things change, do a baseline, and move things forward. The question was more broadly about the Powell corridor being a really interesting space, not just the area I pointed to, which is sort of the gentrification area, but as you move out, how it doesn't function in a number of ways. It's hard to cross the street in certain places. There's big areas that can be built on. My understanding is, and Skip may be able to add to this, that the city has a focus on the Powell corridor, right? That's not us, that's the city, for all the right reasons, right? They're trying to make it an economically, more developed area all the way out to Gresham, right? So that's the intent of the city over the next 10 or 15 years. The thing that's really exciting for us is that we're in early enough that we can start to instrument that and learn from that and learn in a data-driven sense. So as the next city that comes along, or even as we progress down Powell, we can learn from the data, which has never really been possible before. So I think it's the existence of the Powell project that the city is focused on that makes this really interesting to do in Portland. Mm-hmm. And of course, the fact that it's a city that's open to civic action in a way. It's a city that is not shy of technology, but also doesn't live on its technology. It's more of a livable city. So I think we've got a lot of things going for us in Portland, and I'd love to see exactly what you're talking about happen. We're not going to go in as a group and make that happen. The city's already doing that. We're going to go in and make it data-driven, which I think is exciting.
Yeah, so my understanding of urban development is it's many orders of magnitude slower to change than, say, Amazon.com. So I'm wondering whether you feel like real-time sensors could provide a lot of value compared to traditional urban planning research methods.
Well, gee, I would think there's a lot of ways, and I think we'll probably all take a shot at that one a little bit. I mean, the question was, given that there are different timescales associated with things like Amazon.com and how a city develops, why is it that we think live data relevant? I think was that fair? Yeah. There's so many different ways to answer that. I'm not quite sure where to start. So a lot of the transient data is actually very relevant. It's very hard to collect with the normal mechanisms that we've used. A lot of events are actually quite short in time and can have long time effects. So there's a lot of work that we've done in the real-time data in order to do local reduction of data. I'm not sure I'm quite answering your question, but I wanted to at least get sort of the background of what's the difference between the short-term and the long-term data. I think a lot of what I talked about particularly is the long-term data. It's if I build a building here or if I change these lighting patterns, what does it do over time to the environment? And those are long time frame. but they are affected by the transients. I give you an example. It's not a particularly city example, but it's more of a house example. But I can imagine the same things happening at the city level. When I'm managing my house and the power use in my house, which I could do much more efficiently than I do, I would like to know what it is that's burning power. I can look at my power bill and I can say, well, basically I think in the summer I'm, using more AC and therefore I'm using more electricity, and in the winter I'm probably burning my gas fire, and that's not helping me an awful lot in making any immediate decisions about what to turn on and what to turn off. What would help me is knowing what device is turning on when and what difference it's making to the overall power. Now, I could go in and instrument the whole house and change all my devices. That's actually very difficult to do. If I can put a transient sensor on the power supply to the house that's working at 60 hertz, 60 kilohertz, 60 hertz, 60 hertz would be enough, working at 60 hertz, I would be able to tell certain transients that happen when my refrigerator turns on. It's not just off on, there's some bounce that happens when that happens. And if I've got enough data about that bounce, I can disambiguate that from when something else turns on. So now I can start to get those characteristics. And actually, interesting thought, that you could have a database of those characteristics that are known, and you could search for your characteristic. You find a characteristic, you do a search on the web, it tells you, oh, this is a Samsung refrigerator that just turned on at this point. So you can actually get a lot of this stuff automatically. Once I know that, then I have a lot more decision making I can do. I could say, gee, if I readjusted my refrigerator so as it turned on only in the evening, then I could do different things. If I made sure that I turned my heat off, half an hour before it reached certain temperature, I still get the temperature I want. In fact, I don't go over that. Those are the short-term things that actually have big long-term effect. So I think, it's hard for us to, it's hard now why you want to collect detailed data, and you probably don't want to take the 60 hertz data and stick it in a database. You probably want to do some kind of decision making at the endpoint like we would there. I don't want to measure all that data and send it back to a database. I just want to know that transient means my Samsung refrigerator just turned on. So there's all sorts of ways in which we will go through all of this data and figure it out. But having more data right now will allow us to figure out what we want to keep and what we don't. I'll throw it over to you, Mike.
Yeah, it's a great question, and I think the one of the things to consider is, in some ways, urban planning as a discipline has been defined by, the inputs, right? So what can you use to inform your plans? And historically, that's been data, I think, that's collected on a quarterly basis at best. So you're looking at things like population, demographic information. The opportunity, I think, is to, by providing more, and whether it's real time or it's, once a day or once a week or once a month, you could argue about the value of being able to say, what's this one thing doing at this point in time? But what that enables you to do, I think, as Wilf is talking about, is aggregate up to different intervals, which currently there just isn't access to, right? So the question of how would that inform your urban planning is really interesting. I think one of the things we've seen is that urban planning and urban begins to really blur. So suddenly, you've got people who are looking at big planning, urban plans, thinking about things like traffic flow and how do they impact. One of the common things everybody cares about is how quickly can the fire truck or ambulance get from the fire station to my house. And so that's a classic urban planning problem where you want to, lay out the streets and lay out the fire stations in such a way that you get well, suddenly that begins to change when you can think about not just, where are the people who are most likely to have medical emergencies, but you can also start to look at things like energy usage and things like real-time traffic patterns. So suddenly your urban plan becomes informed by all of these other inputs that currently there's just no idea. It's this big sort of blank slate. So when your urban planning department can suddenly say, well, to optimize our plan, we need to change the light patterns today in order to get fire trucks from here to here, it becomes sort of a new discipline. So, I think back to the Amazon example, what before the internet, would you have said, how does the internet make brick and mortar bookstores better? Well, it took Amazon getting, this new technology and really applying it in a different way. Same thing with data in cities. It's really going to change the way that, planning and operations of these cities is done. And, who knows what that actually will mean on the ground? What's the killer app? Is that helpful? Yeah. All right, Skip, do you have anything?
That was great.
What hard goals and timelines does this current project have?
Well, the Global Cities Challenge, as Skip said, it's June 1st. So that's a pretty hard deadline. We get two things. One, we're hoping to get a city official to give a talk at the Geographic, I can't remember which building it is, but it's right downtown in DC.
National Building Museum.
Thank you, National Building Museum, which is apparently a very beautiful building. I haven't been in it.
It is.
Yeah. And we get a booth space to show stuff off, and I think we all have something we want to show off, and we'll get to see a lot of other things going on. I think that's pretty much the end of at least this cycle. They may do something again afterwards. I think what we're all interested in is the contacts that we're going to make there and bringing people together to do that. So I think at some point or another we need to be able to project ourselves as a team more effectively into the sort of global melee of people who are doing this kind of stuff, and try to make sure that we're winning our own business. Certainly, as far as Intel's concerned, we are quite well connected already. Around with a lot of partners, but I think the thing that is really interesting is the idea of a test bed that we could build here. And while we're quite well connected, I don't think we really have a clue what we're doing yet, just like everybody else.
We've been calling it like the smart city breadboard, right? So you could sort of plug in whatever you'd like into the breadboard of the smart city and see how it works.
Is there any particular piece of data that you feel is like the most essential for any smart city project?
Take that one, Mike.
That's a great question. I don't. I think somebody mentioned this in one of the questions. One of the important things to recognize about this is every city is different, and the data that's going to be most important to New York City or Washington, D.C. isn't necessarily going to be the data that's most important to Portland, which is why Portland is a different place to live than New York or Washington, D.C. So in some ways, I think the question or the answer is they're all really important, and they're going to be important in different ways. So how do you build something that is supportive and foundational for whatever the data is going to be, because it's going to change over time too, right? I mean, technology changes, cities change, demographics change. So how do you continue supporting the needs from a technology and from a data standpoint without necessarily, trying to dictate what is the most important piece of information that people are going to use, because it's probably different.
There's a question. Yeah.
So kind of like more of a macro question about like looking at the data from like power usage. Like, do you feel like that some of the security concerns, which don't really seem to be sufficiently addressed, I'm not sure this is the right channel to answer to that, but like that would slow the progress of this general area in particular, that like the public's one of their first exposure to IoT will be through smart meters.
I could do the Intel plug first. We love security, and we do a lot of work to secure everything. I think it is a very tricky space. I mean, and I think we are overly sensitized to security issues that we haven't yet run up against. Right, the fear is almost worse than the situation. We deal with security, and we do a lot of work to secure everything. I think it is a very tricky space. I mean, you overly sensitized to security issues that we haven't yet run up against. Right, the fear is almost worse than the situation. We deal with a lot of the worst security problems socially. Right, that's how we do it. When credit cards first came out, we all kept our what do we, I don't even know what we call them now. I used to keep all the copies of the stuff because we were worried that somebody would get our number off the copy. Nowadays, if somebody gets our number, yeah, it's very inconvenient, but gets our number, yeah, but most of the will block a card and make you whole, and it's fine because there's no way to actually make it entirely secure. There are some really serious problems if you start to put the power grid on the infrastructure and whether or not somebody can come in and mess with the power grid. But people try to mess with the power grid without it being connected. So you can't actually eliminate the security problems. And there was an attempt, I think in the last few years to take down a power grid by shooting out a few of these insulator down a power grid by shooting insulator. It was clearly kind of so there are people doing it, and we know that there are people hitting the internet all the time to try and get control of things. And the more things that get connected to the internet, the more that those things will happen. I think we will develop better security as we do every day anyhow. But I think a lot of it's going to end up being, what's a social risk level for these things and how.
Choices between like absolute security or networking products,
yeah.
right? But choices between like networking products.
Yeah.
We know being on the table that most of the world uses encrypted chip, which is never perfect security, but like, they have much better security than we do. But like now with these major ways their own people and stuff, like now we're trying to recalculate, hey, is this cost not worth it?
Right. Yeah, I think there's a lot to learn here, in the same way as there was in learning about security on the internet, right? But
yeah,
you go.
Sorry, glasses. Yep, purple. Yep. All right, thanks.
Fortunately, my personal massage device isn't on the grid. But in all seriousness, I think if I read correctly, your hackathon this Saturday has high school kids and college kids.
Yes.
So that being said, what do you wish college kids knew so that they could be better workers for places? College kids so that they could be.
I think the technology is changing rapidly, and the people who really understand it are the people who come in having used it. I've watched this as my daughter came out of college and understood what I was working on better than I did, because it was natural to her. It wasn't something new and cool. I think what we need out of kids coming out of school right now is to understand that everything is connected, and to understand how that's not a bad thing and how they can take advantage of the fact that everything's connected. So I think exposing them to this kind of technology early is the way to make it natural to them, right? To get them comfortable with it, and they'll build a society that can take advantage of these tools, and they will deal with things like security in the right way. They won't panic about it, and they won't leave it to the hope. They will find some adjusted balance between technology that gives you a level of security that's reasonable, and societal structures that deal with the rest.
Yeah, that's a great question. The technology in some ways is pretty straightforward. So I think that's one of the things we've seen from all of this is there's not this isn't PhD computer science level stuff. So I think flipping that on its head, what would be most useful for college kids and high school kids, and I think where we are sort of stuck in some ways is, what does the future possibility look like, and being able to map, how they live their lives, which in some ways is different than how Wilf and Skip and I live, just because we've grown up in different times with different constraints. Being able to map concept into actual application or idea from a conceptual standpoint, I think is what we always, that's in some ways the hardest thing. The technology, I think this generation is so used to change and learning different technologies, whether it's coding or whether it's, new applications on their phone or whatever it is. I don't worry about that piece nearly as much as, being able to translate that idea and that vision into I think what we all love doing from a development standpoint, building things. So it's sort of an answer. It's a great question, though.
All right. Yep, right here.
I want to pick back up on this whole data question, because this very much aligns with the sustainability going on within the city. Comprehensive Plan 2035 has been going
Mhm.
city. Have you been able to integrate any of that? And as an extension of that, if June 1st is the opportunity of the White House, then what?
I'll-
Does this continue to scale and grow?
Yeah.
Go ahead. Mike.
So one thing we thought about going into the DC event in the fall was what can we leverage that's already in place that provides kind of a policy framework. And one thing that was really exciting to the people in the audience in DC was the fact that Portland already has a climate action strategy. You know, it has the Portland plan. It has all these different planning documents that help to provide a nice sort of cohesive framework on here are the main policy outcomes, and in many cases their interrelationship with one another. And so that provides a great opportunity for us to think about is Joe Zender, who's the in the planning department at the city, says they'd like to think of neighborhood level performance metrics. And so all of this data, all of this level performance metric, and so all of this, the sensors that are being, and that starts to be towards these larger policy goals, because so much of the documents that the city has created were done so with outreach and stakeholder meetings and citizen and input, able to sort of engage and empower people to make better decisions that are informed. And to, whether it's real time or in a more planful sense, this data and this sort of smart city revolution is something that I think is going to be a really powerful tool to help move what Portland has become known as sort of an urban planning mecca, and taking that kind of the next level. Both from a policymaker standpoint, but I think to your point, even more importantly, with regard to how a relatively active population here can become even more so and more engaged, more involved, more informed. You guys want to take a whack at that one? Whack at that one.
I think the big Skip said is what are we measuring? How are we measuring success? I think that's the biggest unknown, and where there's the real opportunity from a management leadership standpoint within the city is to go from large geographic scales or large time scales to things that are more fine grained, and be able to say, here's how we're going to measure success, and here are the actions that we're going to try and take at these different levels. And the data is, again, the data and the technology is in some ways the easy part of it. It's getting people to think about the policy management standpoint from a different perspective.
And there are, of course, challenges in that, because there's certain things that, an elected official might not want to be held accountable for, to put out there in terms of a metric. And conversely, there are also some really great wins that go unnoticed because the achievement is not communicated effectively. And so there's this cuts both ways. Data is a tool. And I think it can be used to help really inform the population to get them more engaged. And it can also be really illuminating in ways that we probably never anticipated.
Yeah, no, I think that's exactly the right way to think about it, right? We're trying to plug in as much as we can to that kind of civic infrastructure, and we recognize that, as has already been said, that the data is the tool, and if it's used incorrectly, it won't help anyone with anything. And I think that's really one of the things that makes Portland interesting is we do have the infrastructure. We are thinking that way. We are civically minded. We're not just going to barrel in. I think some of the new cities that were mentioned earlier, they've got some of their own problems, right? Because they didn't have the society there already guiding where it went. I think Portland has that. It has its own culture. That will drive how the technology is used, and hopefully drive it towards a more livable city, right? I think I think that's really the end objective, and hopefully we'll get there.
All right, there's a couple questions in the back. Yep.
Wow, I think I'll restate that piece. I've been really interested in the work that Sarah Architects has done around the civic ecology piece, right? So the feedback, And I think Portland, as I'd said earlier, I think is a city that is more amenable to that kind of active participation, and I think it's critical. So I think that gives us a uniqueness. I think there's a lot of things that you could find other cities that have pieces of it. The fact that we're a little weird, the fact that we're willing to try different things in different places, that we've got these various different environments, that we're trying to do, high density, we're trying to do, high mixed. These are all really interesting things, and getting data in these kinds of spaces, I think, will be valuable for city planning overall. I think you could probably get pieces of it in other cities, and there may even be some other cities that are capable of doing the same thing, but I think we're pretty top of the list. I think it's really interesting. I've seen a lot of other cities out there, and they're doing some really interesting things, but I still like the idea of doing something in Portland. I think it's really interesting.
Yeah, I think transportation data. I think Portland's got more sensors and more modes of transportation than just about anywhere else. So I mean, we were, as part of this project, is everything from getting data off of buses in almost real time to traffic flow data, cars, to actually think about putting little sensors on bikes and tracking bike-only traffic around the city. So, the idea that Portland has this great resource and has invested a huge amount of money in alternative forms of transportation, I think gives it a huge opportunity to demonstrate the value of that and the return and the investment to the city and the population in ways that certainly other cities just don't, they can't.
I also think there's some really great stuff going on with like OHSU and their Orca Tech program, which is focused on aging in place. And so the notion of deploying sensors in an environment, a living environment where an elderly person can maintain his or her primary residence essentially without having to go to assisted living and have that disruption. And so a lot of the health indicators can be monitored remotely. And so there's a certain sense of independence, ironically enough, with that situation. And there's opportunities, I think, to look at how not just moving sort of vehicles with people in them, but also how people are moving and sort of health and wellness. And so you have the Portland region is kind of the center of the athletic and outdoor industry. You have this kind of burgeoning healthcare movement here with OHSU and the Night Cancer Challenge, and then a lot of startups in that space. And I think there's a lot of interesting sort of raw materials here for some cool stuff that intersects in many cases with transit, especially when you start thinking about public and active forms of transit. All right. Yes.
How do you decide the size of the funding, the priority of the future? How do you measure your
I didn't quite catch the question.
So it was how do you prioritize the funding amount?
The size of the fund,
Mm-hmm.
and also how do you decide the priority of the resources?
Yep.
How do you measure, how frequently you measure the result?
Wow, that's a good question, and not sure we've got far enough to answer it yet. I can give you plenty of examples of situations where we are monitoring things. The funding question, I think, is still to be raised. My understanding is that I don't remember the numbers, but it's a very large amount of money that's being spent down the Powell Corridor in the next 10 years. So, at least 3 digits of billions that will be spent not by the city, but by by developers and other things along that corridor. So it doesn't take a very large percentage of that to make a pretty good technology investment, and a technology investment that might improve efficiency by a fairly significant amount. So I think that the thing that's going to drive this is that better decisions save a lot of money, and that will make people do it just by the basis of being able to save that money. I mean, you saw a couple of the numbers that I threw up here of wasted energy. You don't have to make a very big dent in that to pay for the technology for the sensors. So I think that what we're really trying to do here is we're trying to understand those mechanisms and how they will work it's harder to relate that back to frequency of sensing. I think it very much depends what you're trying to do in each particular case. We may well go into situations and measure at one rate and then realize we don't have enough or we have too much. We'll cut back or we'll raise it. I think those are the kinds of questions that we're really interested in getting an answer to. Right now, all the companies involved here are pro bono, right? We're doing this under our own nickel to figure out, because we think we're gaining information from doing this. And I hope to some extent, other companies and other Portland area folks come into it, because I think building that kind of expertise is what will make this a center for this technology, right? A lot of people are looking at this and going, oh yeah, it's not ready, we're not doing anything. And I think that's a fine decision to make, but I think jumping in earlier gives you a really good handle on being a leader. Mike, did you want to add to that?
More and more.
That's to the money and the frequency.
Yeah.
Right?
Exactly.
Yes.
Yep. Mm-hmm. Well, we'll have you talk to the privacy guy after this, and you guys can hash it out. It's a great point, and I think that's the juxtaposition. Is there's a lot of opportunity to sort of democratize data collection, and there's nothing stopping you guys from writing the be all end all app that collects every piece of information off of the phone and sends it to a server and makes it publicly available. You do that tomorrow if you wanted, I'm sure. The challenge, I think, is both navigating, how do you figure out all of the intricacies that would go along with that. But then, then thinking through what are the implications for government. I circle back around. I think the opportunity, if this wasn't totally clear from a business standpoint or from a non-technical standpoint, the opportunity, I think, is the public-private partnership model. So being able to, even the data that we're pulling, some of it is governmental data, some of it is sort of pseudo-governmental data. There's nothing, I think, Skip, you were talking with some private companies who are interested in throwing rideshare data in metrics. There's reason from a technical standpoint that can't be and probably shouldn't be a part of the ultimate solution. However, the challenge isn't the technology, it's figuring out how do you do that in such a way that you don't, alert everybody and raise red flags and, all that fun stuff. So,
yeah, I think that's the right way to think about it. The shift in, at the end of the day, it's the people who live in the city who will decide how quickly it changes, right? And to some extent, it's us that's a little bit. We don't like having things change around us too much when around the city. So I think as this technology moves forward, we will push, right? I mean, we've just seen it with Uber, right? Who would ever think that the taxi system would be able to change quickly? It's never changed quickly before. Well, Uber before, putting an enormous amount of pressure and will continue to do so. Why is that? That's because we demanded it, right? We said, yeah, it's not okay to just block them, right? We expect to have Uber here, it works. And so I think those are the things, and it will change differently in different cities because we have different priorities about how to do it. The public-private partnership is the mechanism, I think, is going to allow this. The cities themselves typically, we don't want them to raise taxes so as they can infrastructure. So the way it will probably happen is that organizations will be asked to bid on managing the streetlights in the city, and they will spend an enormous amount of money putting LED streetlights out and probably other sensors in them at a much lower cost of electricity, and they will amortize the cost of capital investment over multiple years, because a city can't really do that, but a private institution can. And models like that have a lot of work. There's a local company called Pangea. They're part of a conglomerate group called GET, I think, which is Ken Motler's organization, and they're doing work in Manila to replace the jeepneys with electric vehicles. And that's a really interesting pattern, because clearly the city is not going to buy a whole bunch of electric vehicles. The electric vehicles are owned privately anyhow, and they want to keep everybody employed and everybody in place. But they've got a very interesting set of mechanisms for how each constituent that's involved in that can work through a mechanism that allows them to replace a large number of polluting vehicles with a smaller number of much more efficient vehicles, give the people who drive them a much better working day, have them pick people up, reduce the congestion on the streets. I mean, it's a whole series of things. Now, once we go through that, and we've seen that happen, it'll be much easier to repeat those kinds of models.
We're also now moving towards Africa. And
Yes.
The White House in the last week of April as well is one of 50 business
Mm-hmm.
leaders to debrief the White House. So
Right.
that's gaining steam. It's going to be an interesting one.
Are you part of Ken's group? Yeah, no, I think it's incredible. I mean, I think those are the kinds of business models that are going to make this possible, and it is through those kinds of public-private partnerships that these things will happen.
And then also, in terms of the phone is sort of a sensor that a lot of people have. William Henderson, he was listed with the Ride. If you haven't checked out his app Knock, he's created kind of this iteration of it for purposes of leveraging people's phones and the ubiquitousness of it, and having people kind of ride around and collect information on bike routes and environmental data that is then being shared with the city. So it's an opt-in, right? And when I worked for the city, we launched this thing called PDX Reporter, which is an app that allows people to report graffiti and other types of potholes and things. And of course, when we launched that, it wasn't as though we had co-opted something that people were already signed into. It was rather that it was an opt-in. And so I think there's a lot of opportunities like that where, with the right type of marketing and awareness around the fact that an app like that exists, and here are the terms of the experiment that you as a resident of Portland can participate in, and here's what the city is going to be doing with it, here are the parties involved, here's the types of data. I think all that information is going to be with it. Here are the parties and the types of data to be important, and expectations that were raised earlier.
Is that our signal?
I think so. All right. Well, I want to first say thank you to our panelists tonight, and thank you all for coming.